What is new in the challenges of contemporary Mormon polygamy? We'll talk about that next on Polygamy. What love is this? We welcome you to our discussion on polygamy. This time we have a special guest who has recently become active in efforts to bring truth up against the deceit of polygamy, Joseph Smith style. Angela Kelley is the new director of Sound Choices Coalition, a Utah nonprofit organization which is dedicated to raising awareness and working to end the damaging practices associated with polygamous cultures. Prior to her position with Sound Choices Coalition, Angela served as a volunteer events coordinator for Operation Underground Railroad for 3 years. The social causes she is most passionate about are children's rights, child abuse, trafficking, domestic violence, and polygamy. Her interest in polygamy stems from her upbringing in the mainstream LDS church. And towards the end of 2017, she decided she really wanted to get involved with a charity that was more specific to Utah. This led her to eventually meeting Brielle Decker and Roy Jeffs. No amount of research could have prepared her for the realities of what polygamous cultures are like, except for talking to real people who lived it and left. So I would like to introduce and welcome our special guest, Angela Kelley.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angela, for coming.
You're welcome.
Sharing. And we have contact information that if people want to get a hold of you, we put it up on the screen, and they can contact you if they want to get involved.
Mm-hmm. Yes, for sure.
Have questions or concerns or anything like that.
Anything they want.
Anything like that. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Now, you mentioned Brielle Decker. We have been involved with her quite a bit through these past few years. And Roy Jeffs, you said that their story touched you deeply. What were you unprepared for? You said
my goodness.
That was specifically with her and his story.
Well, so having been raised in the mainstream church, I was aware of polygamy, right? Like on a very basic level.
Right.
Polygamy is only having more than one wife. That's it. Mm-hmm. For a while I lived down in St. George. I'm not from Utah, but I lived down in St. George in 1997, 98. And so we saw people from the FLDS.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And in my mind, I really truly thought, well, they must want to live it. They must want to be there like it. But I didn't know what that entailed. Mm-hmm. I thought maybe they had stricter rules. Maybe they had followed all the main rules, but then just had more. Mm-hmm. Like they lived polygamy, so not only did they share their spouse, but they wore the different clothes and probably homeschooled their kids. But I really didn't think beyond that at all. Yeah. My mind just didn't go there.
And I think that that's typical of most people.
Yeah, and I think so many of us are caught up in our own lives. Like I was busy. I had 3 children in 3 years. And so I was a busy young mom, So even though I did see...
You probably didn't realize there was tens of thousands of polygamists either.
No idea. Definitely no.
Yeah.
Had no idea how many or even what the reality of it was, right? Like what does it really mean when you're living polygamy in any... And I actually don't even think I knew that there was FLDS and AUB in Kingston.
Right.
I don't even think I knew that.
That's typical as well.
Yeah, because you're just not... In Mormonism, in the mainstream church, nowhere are you learning about it. Mm-hmm. And, how would you know?
How would you know?
How would you know? So I like how you introduced this, because no amount of even reading anything could have prepared me for when I spoke with Brielle and with Roy.
When you got the real down-to-earth story.
Even so much so that, I've read a lot of books of people who have left. Even those, as good as they are and as powerful as they are, can't prepare you for sitting across the table from someone who's lived it.
Mm-hmm. And hearing their story as they told it. And seeing the emotion. And sometimes retelling your story can bring you to tears or bring you into a different type of an emotional challenge with them. So you were raised LDS, but you did not realize the reality of Section 132 by...
No, I mean, not at all. I mean, so this was another thing that I've thought about recently. I mean, D&C Section 132 today, and in all of my upbringing in the church, was separated into, like, we have current temple marriage, and then the other part is about polygamy. I didn't know until I did in-depth research that D&C 132 was always about polygamy.
Always about
but it's
polygamy.
actually not that hard to figure out because it says it right in
It
in the opening paragraph that this was in response. And that always confused me, actually, because I was, when I was active in Mormonism, I was gospel doctrine teacher and Relief Society teacher. I studied all these things, and I actually grew up with journal discourses in our house.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. When I would read over those things and like mention it to my mom, I'd be like, what do you think about this? Oh, well, you know, that was a long time ago.
Then.
And, you know, it's easy to brush stuff like that away.
Very, very, very much so, and there's thousands of people who do.
Yeah.
So now you are the director of Sound Choices Coalition, which was started by Kristen Decker. She's been
Yes.
on our show actually a couple of times, and we reviewed her book and talked about her experiences as well. Why are you taking the helm? She was the director, now you are. Why are you taking the helm of Sound Choices Coalition, and what do you want to accomplish, and what's your strategy?
Well, really what made me want to be more and more involved in this issue is there are a lot of organizations that are talking about this now, more so than, say, 10 or 15 years ago, right? There are more, and there are some great ones. But in my mind, the more I learned about how awful it really is, like when you ask the question, okay, are people leaving these groups because they heard there was some freedom out here? Why are they leaving? Did someone tell them there was a better life? No, that's not the answer that you get. The answer that you get is they would rather die. These are people that are leaving everything, not just their religion, their entire community, their family, their friends. Surely it's because someone told them they were oppressed, right? But that's not the answer.
That isn't it.
That's not the answer at all. And so in my mind, I just had to be involved somehow. Like, how could I? I mean, you know, so Kristen and I became friends. Really, really, she's an incredible lady. I can't say enough good about her.
Yeah.
And I really don't want to cry on this show, so I'm going to try not to. But I really think we were just meant to know each other. Kristen and I really have connected on many levels. And I can see now her frustration on the state of things in Utah with polygamy. So many people don't know what's going on. And so we were talking one day and she just said, yeah, I'm just really ready to just like be done with it. It's just, it's so difficult and nobody wants to listen, and how many people have to tell their stories.
So
and
many challenges.
And I was like, wait a minute, like, you can't do that, like, because the other organizations, like what you're doing and some others, are doing great things, but Sound Choices Coalition is specifically dedicated to calling it out, black and white, this is horrible, and being actively involved in legislation, in the legislation, which is so important. And I was like, you can't, like, Kristen, you can't. And she goes, well, if I could find someone to do it. And I go, okay, I'll do it. Like, I mean, I wasn't jumping up and down, and I didn't know.
I think it's a perfect part for you. I think it's great.
The more I've learned about it, the more excited I get.
We were talking earlier, as you are moving into being the director, we were talking about the new logo that you're coming up with, and you explained liberty. Part of the logo it has liberty, Lady Liberty in there. Explain what liberty means. That is so profound.
This is fascinating. So in my research for a new logo, I really wanted a woman on there. And it led me to this study of liberty. Now, the whole idea of liberty is coming from the Roman and the Greek goddess Liberty. But as I studied it, I realized that liberty, when you read the Declaration of Independence, it says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It doesn't say freedom in there.
Right.
And I was like, well, why doesn't it say freedom in there? That's interesting. Because at the same time of coming up with this new logo design, I was trying to think of what's a one word that we can use in our swag that we want to have, like T-shirts and just stuff that we can, for branding, right? And I knew I wanted a word like freedom, but I didn't want to use freedom because freedom is used a lot. And so as I researched liberty, I realized they're totally different, which it's just, to me, I feel dumb, but it's also really cool. So you can actually live in a free country like we do.
Right.
In Utah, we are free in Utah. But you can live in a free country and not have liberty. And the reason why is because liberty is being free from oppression. And so when you really study these polygamous groups that's based on D&C 132, there's no freedom there. But the reason why there's no freedom, you can't say freedom, it's too big, is that there's no liberty. Right. They live in a free country, they live in a free state. Yes, they could walk away, right? Everyone says that. Well, they could leave. People say that with domestic violence too. Well, they could leave. But they're oppressed. They're oppressed in their community, in their religious community.
Right.
So there's no liberty.
There's no liberty.
So yeah, that's the new, she's the highlight in the new logo. It's this female personification of liberty.
That is beautiful because that's exactly that precisely explains what is going on with the people in polygamy groups. And it doesn't just have to be a woman, although most of the time it is a woman. It can also be the male. The male species is also brainwashed as they grow up in the polygamy group.
But girls are pretty to look at.
And
so.
the girls are more into the slavery and the oppression, of course, than the boys are.
Right.
Some of what we're going to talk about are taken from what you've posted on Facebook as doing this research on different aspects of Mormonism and Mormon polygamy. And some of them reflect the shock that you have come in some of the situations that you've come about, not only about the early Mormon polygamy and how they treated females, but the treatment of females and children in today's polygamy group. So we're going to develop some of these as we go. The first one was a post that you made on the topic of Joseph Smith and John Bennett, who were bosom buddies. Yep. And Bennett actually became part of Joseph Smith's inner circle at first, as it ended up being. And we're not going to go into all of the details of all of that. That's too long. There's just one thing I want to talk about. It's a page that you posted from a book entitled A True Origin of Mormon Polygamy by Charles A. Shook, which indicated that John Bennett referred Joseph Smith's plural wives to an abortionist. So, very quickly, the LDS deny that Joseph Smith had sex with his wives, but the Book of the Doctrine and Covenants, the Book of Mormon says the only reason you can live polygamy is to have righteous seed. Right. So that's contradictory. That's a problem there. Our critics always...
Well, it even says it in D&C 132 as well.
To raise up righteous seed.
Right.
So the problem is our critics will say, well, where are all his children? If he had sex with them, where's the children? So in the page you referred to, John Bennett introduced the answer, which was a long instrument to produce abortions with Joseph Smith's ladies. And we have a quote from page 131 of that book.
Yeah, I'll read it.
Okay.
This was fascinating to me to discover this because, of course, everyone asks this question: where are all the children?
Yeah.
So when I read it, I was like, well, it makes perfect sense to me. Okay. Quote: while giving Bennett his book, I observed that he held something in the left sleeve of his coat. Bennett smiled and said, "Oh, a little job for Joseph. One of his women is in trouble." Saying this, he took the thing out of his left sleeve. It was a pretty long instrument, of a kind I had never seen before. It seemed to be of steel and was crooked at one end. I heard afterwards that the operation had been performed, that the woman was very sick, and that Joseph was very much afraid that she might die, but she recovered.
So I've wanted to talk about abortion in early Mormonism for a long time, but there's very little information.
This is the only thing I've found on it.
I have found maybe one or two other just little small snippets, so not enough to really get a lot of information, but it makes sense since there is not, even with DNA testing, they haven't found a lot of them. But it would be logical if he had 33 plural wives. He did have sex with those wives because the women said they did. Right. Where are all the children? Right. So that's a good thing for our viewers even to maybe research themselves, which is what we always want them to do.
That book you can find online. You can read the whole thing.
I downloaded it online. Then on December 4th, a couple of months ago, you posted brief information about a lady from the All Red group, Nicole Van Tassel.
Oh, yes.
And we had her on a couple of shows previous to this one, so her interview will be has been coming out. And she said her polygamist husband beat her up for 40 minutes, and he was charged with 6 felonies, and they were all dropped and all of that. But you mentioned in your post, we've told her story in the other show, so we don't need to do that now. But you mentioned the sexual crime rate in Utah versus the national rate.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. It's 6 times more prevalent and more likely in Utah
Yes.
than the rest of the nation?
Than the rest of the country.
Even more than South Africa, you said?
Now, this is in polygamy, right? Is that the one?
Yeah, the polygamous communities in Utah are at a crisis level, the rate of a sexual assault.
Yes, because it's 75%.
In the polygamy communities.
The people leaving that have left polygamy are reporting at 75%. Now, what's really shocking about that is...
You know what, it's higher than that with the people I deal with.
Well, that's the thing. The rate is always higher.
Yeah.
That's why when people do report, you need to take it seriously.
Yeah.
Because authorities know that for every person that reports, there's 10 more that don't. Right. So we have 75% reporting sexual assault within these groups. Just that by itself is shocking. But yeah, then we just did the math. They're 6 times more likely than the national rate, 5.3 times more likely than the Utah rate, and more than twice as likely than the worst country in the world. In South Africa, it's 30% reporting. Wow. So...
that should shame Utah, don't you think?
Extremely, yes. And, you know, it's not totally surprising when you study how polygamy works, which we'll talk about later when we were talking about the power and control. And it's almost like it shouldn't be a surprise that there's that much abuse when you see how polygamy operates.
Right, exactly.
Right?
And of course, I was born and raised in polygamy, so I do know how it operates.
Right.
And it's worse now than it was when I was in it.
Right.
It is.
It's not, when you read D&C 132, which are the rules of how this relationship is going to work, when you realize that that entire section is about power and control, it shouldn't be a surprise that there is that much abuse. Abuse stems from power and control.
From power and control, exactly.
It's not a section about love or loving in any way. So, yeah, Utah should be ashamed. Absolutely.
They should be. But and we talked about this a little earlier. When somebody hears "Thus saith the Lord," which Joseph Smith used a lot, polygamy groups use it a lot. There are people out there who really want to please God. So when they hear somebody say "God said," they will do what that person said God said, and they don't ever check it out to find out if it's really coming from God. And that's where they know that they can brainwash and hold people hostage to that, which is precisely what Joseph Smith did.
Yeah.
Which is something that Brigham Young did. I have a quote from something that Brigham Young said about pulling the wool over people's eyes. Let's quote that.
Okay.
It shows you the mindset they had, and they have the same mindset today.
Same mindset. It says one church publication boasted that the manifesto had been given to subvert the cunning of the devil and buy time for the saints, perhaps fulfilling Brigham Young's reported declaration that, quote, "We shall pull the wool over the eyes of the American people and make them swallow Mormonism, polygamy and all." And that's in the Millennial Star, which you can also read online.
Exactly. Which brings us to the page 52 of a book entitled, this is another one that you come across and you sent.
I'm finding all these really cool stuff. I like it that you read it and you want to talk about it.
Oh yeah, it's good stuff. But it's a book entitled, it's written in 1887, entitled Utah Statehood, Reasons Why It Should Not Be Granted, why Utah should not be granted a state. It's got some very good reasons in there. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about maybe the first 5 points of that, why they knew that polygamy should not, or that Utah should not be a state, based on that they were supposed to give up polygamy before they could.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
This document was fascinating to find, and really, some of the most fascinating research that I've done has to do with these type of documents. This is why Utah should not become a state. I mean, I also read the congressional records back then. Just what was the talk around polygamy at the time.
Yeah.
It is totally nothing like what I was taught growing up.
Yeah, for
What I
sure.
was
Have you
taught
read the
growing
Smoot
up was-
hearings?
Yes.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
another one.
And, you know, what I was taught was, oh, Mormons were persecuted because of what we believed, because we had a new revelation, because he saw an angel, because he had gold plates.
That's
None
not.
of that is
That's
true.
not true.
None of it's true.
Nope.
In fact, when you read those congressional hearings, the men in there that are speaking are very compassionate towards the people themselves in Utah, in saying, how do we help them see that this isn't right? Like, this is bad. This is bad stuff, you know? So this is one of those really fun documents. This one.
Yeah, so a couple of the reasons why they, just read a couple of them that kind of hit you.
So the so-called revelation on polygamy stands yet unrepealed by any authority from the church. It is therefore as binding as ever upon the whole Mormon people. So that's just referring to the fact that D&C 132 is still canonized in
Right.
Scripture.
It's still doctrine.
Writing a manifesto didn't take out the doctrine.
And the manifesto wasn't even a revelation.
Right.
It was a declaration.
To whom it may concern.
Right.
Yeah, which was very, I mean, seriously, yeah. Second one here. Up to the very meeting of this constitutional convention, men brought before the courts refused to promise to obey the laws against polygamy and are yet being arrested for the same crime and yet refusing to obey.
And that was the point that I think would have been the background for what you said. Now we know why Utah still doesn't prosecute
Yes.
polygamists, because they never refuted it. They never gave
It's still
it up.
in the doctrine.
It's still in the doctrine, and they still believe they're going to live it someday.
Yeah, that's part of it. Another part of it is that the way the law was written was very conniving.
Yes.
If they really meant it, they would have specified patriarchal polygamy.
Well, the thing is, it is there, and it is in the state constitution that is forbidden forever.
Right.
And we're still not following the constitution in our state because of that.
Right.
There's more to that, but we'll
Yeah.
let our viewers find out more about it.
Yeah.
For the few minutes that we have left, I want to get into the primer, because that's something that you have worked with and worked on, and explain what the primer is, and then we want to talk about the graph that you made up with inserting the Doctrine and Covenants 132 specifications. So explain what the primer is and what you've done with this graph.
Well, I mean, you probably, I think, know more about the history of the primer, but the primer, from what I know, is a document that the state of Utah published to portray, basically, I mean, it was trying to help, it was published for like DCFS, police departments, people working with polygamous communities. It was like to help them understand the culture. But really what they were really trying to do was try to make these polygamous communities appear like everyone else.
Like they were okay.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. And that's what's wrong with it, I think.
Yeah.
But what's really funny is this wheel here.
Okay.
When I came across that part in the primer, I'd already read it several times before I discovered this part. But I was rereading this wheel, and it's called a Duluth model, I believe. And as I was reading it, so this model, they've decided, you know, that abuse is not like on a level like this. It's really like a wheel. And there's things within the spokes that make the wheel go round, right? And those things are coercion. Well, actually, if we look at the original wheel, they don't have spiritual abuse, but they have coercion, emotional abuse, isolation, minimizing, denying. What the primer did was, the primer, because they were trying to make polygamous communities look like everyone else, said, oh, well, we'll take that wheel and we'll put in what abuse might look like in a polygamous culture, because it's very different. You have multiple wives, you have
Right.
lots of children, and you have this authority, this priesthood authority. But as I read it, I was like, wait a minute, I think we could just put D&C 132 right in here.
And very wisely.
I didn't know that it would work 100%. I was just doing it. But as I was doing it, I was like, no way.
Yeah.
It was shocking even to me.
And it was shocking to me and when I read what you have done, because it's so true. It
Yeah.
is so right on.
So it's essentially showing, if you guys would like to look it up, that since D&C 132 is the instructions, it actually says that in the very opening, that these are the terms and conditions. That's the words it uses in D&C 132. The terms and conditions set forth for this, which is interesting that they even use those words in the introduction.
It is, isn't it?
So if D&C 132 is the terms and conditions on how polygamy should operate, then let's put those terms and conditions inside of this wheel and see what that looks like. And it looks like coercion, intimidation, threats, using children. Even the using children one was in there. Minimizing, denying, and blaming, isolation, emotional abuse. It's full.
It's all there.
Of every one of those things. And it'd be nice if we could help people understand that.
It would be. It would be very nice if we could do that, and if we could find, I'm sure there's people who need to know it. Would they? But would they listen?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people are able to see this, because when you read D&C 132, it's appalling.
It is.
Right? It is appalling. For anyone that actually reads it from verse 1 to verse 64, by the end you should be sick, especially in today's world.
In today's world, if a person wants to read it and reread it, go to it with the idea that this was the revelation on polygamy.
Right.
That
Only
Joseph
polygamy.
Smith, right, only polygamy, that Joseph Smith claimed God gave him.
Right.
And when you come to it, because that's exactly why it was given,
right,
then you can see all of this in there, all of that.
Right.
And God's Joseph Smith threatening Emma, God will destroy you if you do not allow me to have 10 virgins, and on it goes.
So it's just helpful to have it in a graph. I think our brains operate really well when we see things in pictures rather than words. And so that's what's so powerful with this graphic, is that it puts it in a picture for our mind to be able to see easier. Like, now we don't have to say, oh yeah, that one verse, that's really bad. Let's look at the whole thing.
The whole thing.
It's really bad.
Yeah.
Very bad.
Yeah. Now, the primer was published when Mark Shurtleff was Attorney General, and the legislature, the people that were coming up against polygamy, had petitioned the legislature for better help, and so they agreed to give $750,000 to help victims of polygamy, and it ended up helping the pro-polygamists, not the victims that really needed. Primer was part of that. It came out of part of that.
Yeah, what the primer did was, from what I can tell, horrible.
It didn't help. It didn't help.
I mean, because the pro-polygamists manipulated it so well.
They did. They
manipulated it so well.
And I went to a couple of those meetings at the beginning of this $750,000 grant, and I went to a couple of meetings. One of them up here, one of them down in St. George, and you don't go in there and say anything against polygamy or you're banned. I'm telling you, it was not a good place to go.
Well, hopefully we can show them this updated
I hope
wheel,
so.
Because this is plain as day. And I think really with the Me Too movement this past year, people with social media and with the way things are, with the way communication is today, we're able to call things out unlike never before. And so, and I mean, it won't surprise me. It won't surprise me if people do still read it and say, well, it was still, because you have that, like you said earlier, it came from God.
Yeah.
But I think if you drop the scales, you just drop everything. Pretend like you don't have anything there, and you read it.
Right, do it that way. And it comes from God, really? That would be my question to anybody. Is God really like this?
Right.
No.
If well, and that's the thing that's interesting, right? You could say, well, maybe that's your God, but the God of the Bible, and I think whatever perception of God that most people would prefer to have, which is a God of love. They're two totally different.
Even the polygamist will say that he's the God of love, but his love is earned by living polygamy, and then he'll love them. But they can lose that love. We talked about that before too. They can earn it, they can lose it as well.
Right.
And that's not the God of the Bible.
Well, I don't think, if we're going by the Bible, I don't think that if you really read it, that it says that God is like this.
Right, exactly.
And that goes back to what you were saying earlier. I think organizations like these polygamous communities are run by people that know that most people aren't going to look.
That's right.
For
they know they can. God said, and they're not going to check it out.
Yeah. What does the Bible really say?
Yeah.
for example?
Well, we're out of time for this time. We are going to do a second part with Angela. She's full of information, and I just love talking these things over with you. So we're going to come back and do part 2 of this discussion with Angela. So we would like to invite you to come back and watch us next time as we discuss her position and what she's doing, new things she's doing with Sound Choices Coalition. So thank you, Angela,
Thank you.
and we'll see you next time. Thank you for watching.